The committee will return to order, and the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Ehlers. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am ready. Amendments at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 284, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5116, offered by Mr. Ehlers of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is somewhat along the lines of the previous amendment offered by Dr. Brown, but is targeted in a specific way. And it will simply require that the loan guarantee program include among its eligibility criteria written evidence from potential purchasers that a market exists for the product for which a loan is requested. Now, that may sound a little cumbersome, but when you analyze it, it's not cumbersome at all, because the information I'm suggesting that they have to provide is simply to show that there is a potential market demand for the proposed innovation. The amount of information required is minimal, and in fact, anyone wishing to go into manufacturing or developing the innovation that they are seeking money for has to provide exactly the same information to a bank that would provide a portion of the funding too. So it would simply say that the federal government would be furnished with the same information that the bank would, and therefore we don't impose any bad requirements or troublesome requirements, but at the same time we get substantial evidence that they have done their homework before requesting the money, and that this is likely to result in a market for the project or the program or manufacturing equipment that they are seeking to fund. So I urge adoption of this amendment.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. It's an excellent amendment, and I think brings clarity to a good program. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
This is a good government amendment that simply ensures that applicants for manufacturing loan guarantees demonstrate that there's a market for the products they're wanting to manufacture. This will help protect taxpayer dollars from subsidizing products that don't have a reasonable chance to succeed in the marketplace. I understand this language is modeled on similar provisions in other loan guarantee programs. Urge the members to support it.
Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Bartlett. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, sir. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 287, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5116, offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The program has a loan portion without any process as to how to administer the loans, and this amendment simply incorporates the Office of Management and Budget Circular Number A 129 for administration of our loans. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. Once again, another good clarifying amendment. Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is, as you say, another good government amendment. It simply requires the Department of Commerce to manage the loan guarantee program consistent with the Office of Management and Budget's longstanding guidelines on programs like this. This will minimize program risk and help protect taxpayers' dollars. As a part of an OMB directive, this should be expected of the agency, but Dr. Bartlett's amendment would solidify this by making it explicit in the law. It's a good amendment, so I hope we support it.
If there's no further discussion, then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbrey.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 290, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5116, offered by Mr. Bilbrey of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is just a sense of Congress that we keep the evolution that actually was started during the Clinton administration, was carried on by the Bush administration, and has now been aggressively implemented by the Obama administration, and that is to make sure that wherever the taxpayers' funds and guarantees go, so goes to the assurance that only those legally present in the country will be hired under this program or under these auspices. And this really just is a sense of Congress, as I'm proud to say you were original co-sponsor of Mr. Schuler's bill that would have made this application universal and eliminated the need for these kind of amendments. But it's the sense of Congress that as we implement these programs that have job opportunities in there, we make sure that we keep our commitment to the American people, that their tax dollars are not being used to violate the federal law. And E-Verify is very simple. It's so simple that every member of Congress uses it, so I guess that's prima facie evidence that anybody can use it. And I just ask that we approve this as a sense of Congress. The administration, I'm sure, will understand our intentions here and follow suit as they have just recently with requiring all contractors in the federal system to use E-Verify. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbrey. As I had mentioned earlier, there were some potential concern about the small and medium-sized or individuals. Mr. Smith, who has a lot of background in this, doesn't seem like that'll be a problem. But I don't oppose this amendment, and we'll be discussing with you if there does seem to be an implementation problem with the smaller people. Does anyone else wish to be? Dr. Brown's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak for this amendment. I think it's common sense, as Mr. Bilbrey said. It's currently federal law that no one, including the federal government, should hire an illegal alien, should rent to or harbor an illegal alien in any manner. Currently, the only way we have of trying as an employer, even in the federal government, is to verify legal status of an individual, is to utilize E-Verify. I have a bill that I introduced in the last Congress called Improve E-Verify that I think will strengthen that program. And so I'm a strong proponent of E-Verify. I'm very concerned as I just move around the Capitol and in the office buildings here. I speak to a number of folks who don't understand what I say in English, even with my southern accent. I know that a lot of people from other parts of the country can't understand what I say either, but they answer in Spanish and say no comprende, and I'm very concerned that the federal government is hiring illegal aliens. And this is just a common sense amendment that puts or codifies that these programs must utilize E-Verify. So I'm a very strong supporter of this amendment. I hope the whole committee will support it. Now yield back.
If there, Mr. Lujan is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just hope that as we look to make sure we're embracing diversity, that speaking multi-languages is something that we embrace, Mr. Chairman, and something that I hope is encouraged. It's encouraged in my home state, my great state. And I think that as we engage in a global business, that's something that should be embraced and not discouraged, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield back my time.
Mr. Lujan, my daughter, we're talking about what language she's going to take next fall. So you're absolutely correct. We'll be a better country as we can reach out rather than just being reached to.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
Mr. Robacher is recognized.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify some matters, very few people who are concerned about illegal immigration or English as the official language. I don't know anybody who opposes the idea of having people be able to speak more than one language. That's obviously something that would be a great benefit and a great asset. The only objection that I've heard through the democratic process and of our country is people raising the issue of whether or not we should do official business in another language, which would then discourage certain people from having taking the effort to learn English as the language, because that's their second language. Every country that I know of that has had more than one official language has has incredible problems because of it. You have separation of people rather than unity of people. So while I certainly agree with my colleague, Mr. Lujan, that we should never discourage someone. And by the way, I speak enough Spanish to get by on, and I lived with a Mexican family in Mexico when I was younger, and I think it's a wonderful thing that the son of that household that I lived in spoke English as well as Spanish, and that I know now a little Spanish to be able to function that way too. But in our country, just as Mexico needs Spanish as their language, we need English as our language to keep us together.
The gentleman yield.
One last point, and that is we now have seen a great deal of consternation over what's been going on in Arizona. And let's just hope that we can get control of this massive flow of illegals into our country, and that we take the steps that are necessary to discourage that flow into our country by what Mr. Bilbray's amendment is all about. At least we are trying to make sure that the federal government, I don't think any company should be providing jobs that will encourage people to come across the border illegally. Otherwise, we are going to be forced to take even more, I would say, powerful steps that may be a little less palatable in order to get control of a situation that is now just totally out of control in various neighborhoods in my state, where people are being raped and murdered by people who shouldn't be here because they're here illegally. We've got, of course, health care and education that's just going down because of this, and the quality for ordinary Americans of their health care and their education is being diminished. We can't let that happen, and that's why Mr. Bilbray and I and others have been so diligent on the issue, and I would yield to my friend Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Roebacker, for yielding. I'm really sorry that Mr. Lujan would not yield me time, and particularly with the tone of voice that he refused the time to me. I was just going to answer your comment by telling you that my wife is trilingual. She speaks Spanish as well as Portuguese very fluently. She grew up in Indiana. She's native-born American. Her parents are both American citizens. She learned to speak Portuguese in Brazil when she lived there. She learned to speak Spanish in Honduras. Her education was in language education. Her first job was teaching English as a second language. We have a 19-year-old son, and I and my wife have encouraged him to learn Spanish because I understand the importance of American citizens, particularly the youth of this country, to be able to speak Spanish fluently. I myself am bilingual. I speak South Georgian English, and I speak South Georgia Redneck. But and I wish I could speak Spanish. I did take Spanish in high school and in college. So I believe in bilingual education. I believe that my kids and all of our kids should be able to speak Spanish. I'm concerned about the official language of our country. I introduced in resources bill, if the plebiscite that we're going to vote on tomorrow was put into place, that English would be the official language of Puerto Rico if it's ever accepted as a state. It was rejected on a partisan line, and I'm very discouraged with that. I introduced an amendment to the bill for tomorrow that would do the same thing. My guess is that my amendment is not going to be accepted. So I'm sorry you took that tone of voice and that kind of attitude, because I do believe in Spanish education. I do believe in Spanish and bilingual ability, and you and I agree on that. And I just wanted to make that comment, and so I yield back. And I thank Mr. Roebacker for yielding.
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Berry is recognized.
if I may, I'll yield to Mr. Lujan in just one moment. For my friend, Mr. Roebacker, be careful next time you see the Swiss ambassador, because he may have a difference of opinion about how dysfunctional his country is with multiple official languages. Secondly, Mr. Brown, I actually support your amendment, and I'm an advocate of English, promoting English within our country. But the concern I had with respect was there seemed to be an assumption that if someone answers you in Spanish, that's prima facie evidence that they're here illegally. And that was the concern I had, and I'd yield to Mr. Lujan if he wants to speak about this.
And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time. I in no regard meant to offend any of my colleagues here, but my concerns did reflect those shared by Mr. Baird, by Chairman Baird, Mr. Chairman. And sometimes I think, especially as a new member, you may take things a little personal where there's concerns, but by no means did I mean to cause any offense, and I do apologize if that was caused. I just certainly hope as we go forward, because of some of the issues that have been raised around the country, that this is something that we just pay attention to a little bit. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Brown asked me to yield, and I'm happy to.
Thanks, Dr. Baird. I appreciate you yielding me another moment or two. And I didn't want to, if my comment, I apologize also if my comment about people answering me in Spanish is any indication of their legal status here, because I have no questions about that. My hope is that every one of them, and my assumption is actually that every person who this federal government hires is here legally. I hope that that's true. I assume that that's true. Is just like I assume a lot of things that are being questioned from our administration and its status is in this about legal status of some members of our administration being in this country. I don't question those things, but the point is we need to ensure, and my whole comment was geared towards, we need to ensure that the people that the federal government hires are here legally. That's what the law, federal law states, and that was my own comment. So if I misstated or if people misconstrued my statement, I apologize, and I hope that you'll forgive me for doing so. And then on a personal note, I want to thank you for the garlic and the pepper that you gave me for lunch. It gave me at least that bit of lunch. I actually did sneak a little bit of pizza, and I appreciate it, Dr. Baird. Thank you so much. I yield back.
De acuerdo, compañero. Reconozco, señor Bilbray.
Yo también.
Mr. Chairman, look, we're not talking language here. In fact, I've seen studies that the second largest group of illegals in this country are Canadians. Okay, we're talking about the fact that there has been a policy in this country since the 90s that we do not subsidize illegal immigration. Since '96, it's been illegal to hire illegals, and we have an obligation to the American people to make sure their tax money is not subsidizing the violation of all our laws. All this does is continue a process that has been bipartisan. Mr. Schuler's been a great leader on that. Many of the members here are original co-sponsors. And this is the only way we can really look our constituents in the face and say, your tax dollar, we've done everything we can to make sure your tax dollars are not subsidizing an illegal activity when it comes to the immigration status of employees. This is a very simple system. Everybody's using it. And again, if Congress can use it, it just shows you how simple it is. And it is one of those items that is a minimal kind of thing that we should do every time we talk about a grant, every time we talk about a contract. We should do that. And I'm very happy to see that the new administration has been very aggressive at applying this to all contractors. I just think we should keep up the good work. A sense of Congress as the administration should apply the same concept to these grants. And I yield back.
Just
Chairman.
to close out, there's before my time expires, there's just one other side to this I think we need to also mention. It is also, the contrary is also true. We have suffered in lost competitiveness in many ways because world-class scientists, Nobel Prize winners, et cetera, from around the world have become increasingly disinclined to visit our country. And I have spoken literally to Nobel Prize winners who at our arrival points in JFK or elsewhere have been harassed by border people, and these folks have been invited by prestigious universities and conferences to come and share their wisdom and knowledge with us, and they've been treated as if they were, because they were from another country, they were somehow subhuman. And we need to also recognize that. I don't disagree with the amendment. I support it, but we need to equally make sure we are more welcoming to folks who are coming here legally who have something to share with us, and I hope we'll also look at that.
Is there any?
Chairman.
Yes, sir, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Bilbray.
Just one point to close on, Mr. Chairman. One of the big successes of this program, it applies to everyone across the board. It does not pick, some are checked and some are not. All applicants, all employees, and it's equal protection and equal enforcement no matter who it is, where they come from, how they speak, or how they may look. Everybody is treated equally on this program, and that's the secret of its success, and I yield back.
Mr. Grayson is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am concerned that this amendment is outside, or at least partially outside of our jurisdiction. It seems to me that this is a matter that's more properly before other committees of the House, and that raising this matter is out of order, and I ask for a ruling on that.
I would ask our counsel for advice.
It's up to you.
Okay. Well, the ruling, Mr. Grayson, is that the bill is relevant, or the amendment is relevant to the underlying text.
I'd like to explore that for a moment, if I may. Since there are other committees like the Homeland Security Committee, the Education Labor Committee, that might properly claim jurisdiction over this amendment, doesn't this potentially compromise the integrity of the bill itself by requiring the bill itself to be referred to those committees before floor action?
Mr. Grayson, I think the important thing here is that it is a sense of Congress and not a mandate, and that it is an area within only the jurisdiction of our committee. And would only apply to Title V there.
All right, I'm concerned about this, and I may raise this issue again, and I think that if this becomes a pattern on the part of the minority, then they may see me, among other things, asking for amendments like this to have a ruling and then appealing the ruling of the chair, and having a vote specifically on whether these amendments are germane, because frankly, I think they're not. I think they're political grandstanding.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like the gentleman's words to be taken down. That last comment was over the line.
Well, I would remind the gentleman.
Well, let's see, Mr. Grayson, your time has expired. I would hope that Mr. Robacher doesn't ask for time, but if he does, he will get it. I will not ask for time. Thank you, Mr. Robacher. I think that we're about concluding this discussion. I think it demonstrates this is a sensitive issue that needs to be really a small part of a larger issue that we need to have a national conversation and a congressional conversation, respectful of all. But today we're dealing in a much more narrow sense. It's simply a sense of Congress. And if I hear no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Lipinski. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 062, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the pizza. Hopefully I'll make things flow more smoothly this afternoon. My amendment would create jobs and support American manufacturers by improving procurement at our national labs and accelerators. It requires the director of the DOE Office of Science to develop a plan for increasing purchases from domestic sources, especially purchases of hardware and instrumentation that we do not currently manufacture. And that's to develop a plan to do this. The primary target of this amendment is not so-called commercial off-the-shelf or COTS hardware, but rather custom manufactured components that are used to build accelerators and other large scientific instruments. By fostering closer collaboration between Office of Science facilities and the small manufacturers who could fabricate these specialized parts, this amendment will result in faster, more efficient procurement and products that better meet the precise scientific needs of our labs. This amendment supports high-skill, high-wage engineering, machining, assembly, and testing jobs at small companies throughout the country. These are manufacturing jobs that support innovation not only at our national labs, but also in the petrochemical, semiconductor, and biotechnology sectors. We need these jobs and the ability to manufacture cutting-edge equipment. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I think this can be very helpful in making sure that we have American manufacturers who remain on the cutting edge. It doesn't put in any requirements except to develop a plan to increase these purchases from domestic sources. So I don't believe we'll run into any, shouldn't run into any problems there. Hopefully, we can agree on this, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that the gentleman would like to increase the amount of equipment used in DOE research projects that's produced here in the United States. However, I'd like to ask Dr. Lipinski what he really means by the term, quote, domestically produced hardware in his amendment. Is hardware limited to electronics? Is it broader? And if so, what all does it encompass? Equipment, computers, electronics, how narrow or how wide is your expectation of the word, and using the word hardware?
Well, we're really talking about custom manufactured equipment that is used at the national labs. That's what we're looking at. That's what it calls for the plan to encompass. So that is what we're looking at. I'll yield back.
Well, I think you've satisfied my question. Thank you.
Further discussion on this good amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 101, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a follow-up to our Energy Subcommittee discussion on earmarks in the Office of Science, I offer an amendment that would call attention to projects often paid for in the science account that may not support its mission. And with this language, the Secretary would detail potential unmet needs and objectives that otherwise would have been met by the Office of Science if congressionally directed projects did not carve out a significant share of its funding. And the example that I mentioned in the subcommittee, and one that some of you may recall, is the Office of Science being earmarked for MRI machines in the last few years, and they cost about $1 million apiece, and we're earmarking for various hospitals. Now, MRIs at one time would have been research and development, but I think that this is something that takes away money for much needed research, and I think we need to stop the practice and keep every research dollar where it belongs in basic research. So, and I'm also confident that I think that with this, with the amendment, it would detour those from using science to pay for their pet projects when the project does not meet science, does not merit science research funding. And with that, I would urge passage of the amendment and yield back.
If there's no further discussion, let me just quickly say that, again, I think one of the benefits of having vigorous subcommittee meetings is to find out these sorts of things. I'm glad you discovered it. This would be a good addition to our bill. And if there's no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. English. Is he here? Then we'll give him just a moment if he's pretty prompt. Okay, here he goes. Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 025, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment we discussed subcommittee that simply adds the words including hydrogen after liquid transportation fuels. And so the Office of Science's Biological and Environmental Research Program is reauthorized and competes. The language bears several differences from existing statute, one of them being that the mention of hydrogen has been removed. This amendment restores an emphasis on hydrogen so that this administration is reminded of Congress's commitment to a hydrogen future. And we had some discussion at subcommittee. The idea is simply to make sure that the deletion of the language doesn't give rise to the implication that it's intentional to take hydrogen out of this this opportunity afforded by this section. So it's simply adding the words including hydrogen after liquid transportation fuels. And yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further discussion on this, again, good amendment? If not, then the vote is called on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska. Mr. Smith, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 005, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment reinserts in the bill language included in the committee print but omitted from the ANS requiring the Director of the Office of Science to report to Congress periodically on the bioenergy research centers authorized in the bill. The amendment requires the Director prepare and transmit to Congress a research plan describing how activities authorized under the program will be undertaken within 1 year of enactment. The Director will also be required to update the research plan and report back to Congress every 3 years following the initial report. This amendment replaces a previous reporting requirement, which will be inadvertently deleted by repealing Section 977 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 in this reauthorization. Because my amendment permits the Director to base his initial research plan on these previously published plans, the burden of this requirement on the Office of Science should be minimal. I thank the Chairman for his consideration. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Olson, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 003, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Olson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to offer this amendment. This amendment would strike activities regarding climate and environmental science activities from the underlying legislation. As is, this provision undermines the goal and purpose of this legislation, which has been sold as promoting competition and creating jobs. Including climate research in this bill does neither. In fact, by supporting efforts to collect information the administration has stated they'll use to provide the background to create more regulation on businesses, this is the antithesis of a job creator. In the district I represent, which has one of the largest petrochemical facilities in the entire world, the companies I've met with have indicated they will lose thousands of jobs. Again, this is not a job creator. This is not meant to trigger debate on the virtue of this research, but to raise the point that this bill is not the vehicle in which it should be included. And as such, I urge the adoption of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. Hall is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the climate and environmental activities from the bill. However, it in no way prohibits the department to continue to perform this research. And I agree with Mr. Olson that this section does not create jobs. It could, however, be used as one of the bases upon which a regulatory regime could be built, and such regulations would place onerous burdens on already struggling businesses, thereby jeopardizing the very jobs this bill is intended to protect and to promote. Whether or not these activities should be authorized is a discussion for, I think, another time. This legislation is not the appropriate instrument for putting the congressional stamp of approval on these activities. A section should be stripped out of the bill. I urge all my colleagues to vote for the amendment.
Dr. Baird's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this and oppose it for a couple reasons. First of all, if the argument in support of the amendment is that a certain activity performed by an agency is inconsistent with the acronymic title of a bill, then we're going to have to be mighty careful or mighty broad with our acronyms. And more importantly, more substantively, there is a long history of fundamental research being conducted within this particular agency that is of significant benefit to climate research. Whether or not one endorses the belief, and I don't think it's a belief, it should be a judgment, not a belief, but whether or not one endorses the judgment about anthropogenic climate change. And let me give you some examples. In the early days of the atomic testing program, a couple things became important. Tracking atmospheric distribution of the clouds that emerged from nuclear testing became central to understanding what, not only domestic testing, but potential ramifications should these weapons be used in war. So a fair sophistication was developed in tracking plumes of radioactive material, and that turns out to be pretty helpful in climate. And to say, well, we're going to say you can't use that research knowledge or technology or methodology, it just seems to be counterproductive. So too, this entity was involved with decontamination of soils. Now, that's an environmental function. And in my district, we've got the Hanford Nuclear Reservation right up the road, or up the river rather, and it's awfully important to us that we can learn more about decontamination. And my fear is that this amendment is going to really unwisely constrain key activities that are beneficial. And then finally, there's an implicit assumption that anything dealing with climate costs jobs. I think the evidence is actually to the contrary, but I'll save that for another debate. But there are fundamental issues here of science that is applicable across a number of disciplines related to the environment and climate that I would hate to constrain and therefore would encourage defeat of this amendment.
Thank you, Dr. Beard. Let me just point out, I mean, there are a variety of, I guess, of opinions in terms of the validity of climate change. This is really not a discussion of climate change today. The Department of Energy has had, really was authorized to research climate research since the Global Change Research Act of 1990. So this is not something that was sort of sneaked in to give them a way to do something. This is authority they've had for many years. And does anyone else wish, Mr. Robacher?
I don't fully understand why, if we are already conducting climate research in various departments and agencies, why that has to be in this bill. Is that not, does that not obscure the purpose of this bill? And for those of us who have a disagreement, an honest disagreement as to the nature of man-made climate change, we see much of the legislation and again, an honest disagreement as to whether or not pursuing that creates jobs or hinders jobs. So including this in the bill, which is extraneous because this type of research is going on elsewhere, does nothing but put the onus on those of us who do believe that man-made climate change is not what the folks on the other side of the aisle believe man-made climate change is. That puts us in a position of we are actually putting something into this bill that will work against the creation of jobs by our frame of reference. Why put this in the bill at all if you've got this type of research going on and permitted and financed in various pieces of legislation, various departments and agencies around the government? Mr. Olson, I would yield the balance of my time to Mr. Olson.
Thank you to my friend, Mr. Rohrbach from California. And with respect to my colleague from Washington, I'd just like to invite you to come down with respect to the job loss, sir. Come on down with me to Texas, to the Port of Houston and the petrochemical facility along that area. And I'll guarantee you they'll talk to you about how climate change and the legislation that's pending before this Congress will cost them jobs, will increase their cost of doing business. Probably some of them are going to go overseas. And so the statement that it doesn't affect jobs is just, at least in my world, that's not very accurate. And again, I don't believe that we should be doing this. We've got legislation and agencies throughout the federal government. My district also includes the Johnson Space Center. And we've got, as this committee knows, with Committee of Jurisdiction, there's tremendous changes and issues going on there. One of the changes is we're generating money by canceling the Constellation to change NASA to get them more involved in climate control. Climate monitoring, global monitoring. And again, I don't believe that's NASA's fundamental mission is human spaceflight. And again, I take a little umbrage to the fact that it does involve jobs. I mean, it really does. And I'd love to have you come down and tour the Port of Houston facility. Yield back.
Thank you. Let me just again point out, Mr. Robacher asked a good question. So why in this bill? Well, the reason it's in this bill is that we're authorizing the Department of Science, or the Office of Science within the Department of Energy. And again, since at least 1990, this has been part of their responsibility. So as this is nothing new, and this is where it's supposed to be, it would be odd if it wasn't there. And, you know, and this is not a debate about climate change, and I even hate to get into that. But let me just point out that Vice President Cheney once said that if there was a 1% chance there was a terrorist attack, that we need to take strong action. You know, there may not be a consensus here, but I think at least 1% of this committee would think that climate change is real, and it wouldn't be inappropriate, if necessary, you know, to have some research.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Well, obviously, that's true of all kinds of spending that's in various departments, all kinds of research projects that are in various departments and agencies. Why highlight one? Why highlight this particular one when obviously there is some fundamental, I'd say honest, but fundamental disagreement on the validity of this whole theory? We're highlighting it here as compared to all those other programs that like you say, are also within those departments and agencies.
Well, with all due respect, you're the ones that's highlighting it. We are, this is a part of already an existing function in the department, or the Office of Science within the Department of Energy. And so this is not something that's trying to be done that's special there.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If no one else seeks...
I yield, I would ask that Mr. Olson, okay.
Oh, okay. If no one else seeks recognition, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbrey. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? Oh, okay, excuse me. We will let Mr. Bilbrey have a second shot at a later date. And let's see. Yes, it is the fusion. Are you our co-sponsor? Would he? Okay. If you don't mind, we'll wait for Mr. Bilbrey to come back. But now he's going to have to wait his turn when he comes back. Okay.
You told him.
Okay. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Neugenbarger. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 068, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Nagelbauer of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think maybe this is a little bit of a continuation, but a little bit different twist on the previous discussion, and that is that says that the top priority of the ARPAE program is to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. You know, throughout this bill before us, the reduction of greenhouse gas emission is emphasized as a policy objective, which I see regrettably at the expense of exclusion of energy independence. While the two can overlap, there are two important differences that we cannot ignore here. The most glaring is that technologies that sometimes enhance the development and production of conventional energy resources, but these resources, can sometimes increase the greenhouse gases, but they're equally important. In fact, to many of us, that we find that if we are truly going to be energy independent, that we'll have to continue to develop some of those resources. But in doing so, I believe that even though some of these may increase the greenhouse emissions, we can make sure that we do everything possible at the same time to reduce the impact or reduce the increase in greenhouse gases. But I think that any kind of research dollars or funding that we're doing as a nation right now, I can't think of a higher priority from a national security standpoint or an economic security standpoint, or creating jobs, retaining jobs, but more importantly, making sure America does not lose its competitive edge. And we are on the edge here in many cases, particularly as our dependence on foreign energy, of really compromising our competitiveness in the rest of the world. In fact, when you look at the countries that we're competing for, they're all out circumnavigating the earth, making deals for energy resources in the future. So my concern is this particular piece of legislation tilts us in the direction of reduction in greenhouse gases when I believe that a better, more sensible direction and directive ought to be that we work on energy independence as the primary goal, and certainly as we are doing that, looking for ways to also reduce greenhouse gases. But I believe that this particular piece of legislation tilts us in the direction of just reduction of greenhouse gases is the primary objective. And I believe, I would hope that everyone on this committee believes that America's dependency on foreign energy is a real threat to our country, and that as a country, one of our goals ought to be to move in a direction of energy independence. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would encourage folks to vote in favor of this amendment for the future of our country.
Well, I appreciate my friend's comments, and I share your interest in trying to reduce our dependency on oil, but I don't want to change from being dependent on foreign oil to be dependent on foreign technology. So there is a balance. If we want to become energy independent, I think that we need to be looking for all sources, and already a main purpose of the ARPA-E is stated as is to reduce our or it is to reduce the goal, well, it's reduce energy imports. So for that reason, I would oppose this amendment. Anyone else wish to be recognized? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. Ayes have it. Or excuse me, the noes have it. Almost. The noes have it.
Everybody heard what he said.
The amendment is not agreed to. That's a do-over. Okay, the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 015, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Smith in Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is intended to address an apparent inconsistency between the ARPA-E governing statute and the execution of the program. When the National Academy of Sciences recommended creating ARPA-E in 2005, it was very clear the program should be built upon certain foundational principles. Specifically, it should fund, quote, out-of-the-box transformational energy research in those areas where industry by itself chooses not to undertake. The statute establishing ARPA-E directs the program to pursue long-term development of energy technologies by accelerating technology advances in areas that industry by itself is not likely to undertake. In other words, ARPA-E is supposed to fund top-level, out-of-the-box ideas, not seeing investment by private industry. This language is very important because it provides direction and sets boundaries to ensure the work sponsored by ARPA-E does not duplicate existing private investment, reflecting the appropriate role of government. Unfortunately, in the first round of ARPA awards in August of 2009, several of the projects funded appear to duplicate existing private sector investment with federal funding. Clearly, if these projects are able to attract significant amounts of private investment, they are, by definition, outside the scope of ARPA-E. Further, involvement in technology areas where the private sector is already active risks putting the government in a position of picking winners and losers, potentially crowding out future investment by private capital. This amendment aims to address this problem by enhancing the principles set forth in the existing statute, stating the program should avoid funding ideas that are already being pursued by private industry. It does so in 3 ways. First, it requires, in applying for ARPA-E funding, applicants disclose the extent of current and prior efforts in the technology area for which funding is being requested. Second, it explicitly tasks the director of ARPA-E with ensuring, in making awards, program managers adhere to the language in existing law, stating that the program should not fund technology areas already being pursued by industry. And third, it requires the ARPA-E annual report to include a summary of the instances of and reasons for ARPA-E funding projects in areas already undertaken by industry. It is my hope these simple steps reinforce the original mandate of ARPA-E providing funding for top-level research outside the scope of the private sector rather than duplicating existing private efforts. I thank the chairman and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. As usual, you have a sensible improvement to
Chairman.
Dr. Baird.
On superficial, I was inclined to accept this because I think I understand what you're saying, Mr. Smith, but there's a premise that you said that I don't support. And if I heard it wrong, correct me, but it sounded like you were saying if there's any significant private investment in an area, then ARPA-E is not appropriate to that area. One of the strengths of ARPA-E, in fact, is that it is stimulating and leveraging private sector capital. And the way it works is, and I don't know if you've talked to some of the entrepreneurs who are in this field, but I've talked to many, many, many. And what ARPA-E can do is help leverage some of the private sector capital, particularly on rather speculative explorations, which are kind of precisely what we want to have happen. And it would go like this. The potential costs of developing a breakthrough technology, given the risks and expenditures and the reach that it may take to get there, is sometimes prohibitive in a quick return capital investment market. But ARPA-E comes along and says, we think there's potential here. You've got some great scientists. You've got a great idea. We're going to kick in some of the money to help make that happen. And if we deny that money, I think we're actually being very, very counterproductive. And my fear, Mr. Smith, is however well-intended this may be, I think you're going to have huge unintended consequences, and I can't support it for that reason. I would urge you to run this by some of the you obviously don't want to be saying, you know, pick your big energy company, they're spending a lot of money, we're just going to give them a little more money. But neither do you want to say that we're going to freeze out venture cap, for example, or even the big guys if they're working on some exploration. I'd be happy to yield some time to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. And if I could, it's not a mandate. He's not requiring that if you have funds from elsewhere that you cannot get it. It's just it has to be disclosed, and that the the director then will have to make some determination. And then I would say to Mr. Smith, this is not a situation where one company has been making investment and then they say, okay, give me some more. By and large, what's happening is they may be going in a particular direction, and there'll be a consortium that will come in, each bringing in different types of good ideas, as Mr. Baird says, then to scale it on out to something that can be beneficial.
Right, but to add emphasis,
Okay.
I guess.
Okay, Mr. Smith's recognized.
Thank you. It does not preclude it, but it simply discloses and monitors it so that we can make sure that there's not a duplication or an unnecessary use of taxpayer dollars when private venture capital or other sources are more appropriate.
I share that. I don't know if somehow the time got lost from me there. I think I had some left, but let me reclaim what I had left. I just want to be real careful that we don't take entrepreneurs who should be working in energy exploration and development and turn them into people who have to research how much capital's gone. Because one could say, let's suppose I'm working on an innovative technology to separate hydrogen and oxygen from water and then use it in a fuel cell, for example. In the course of what should be trying to make the pitch for the energy potential of my application, I don't want to make those people then turn into researchers into prior investments, et cetera, et cetera. I want their focus to be on energy, not spending a lot of time saying, well, you know, BP did this and Shell did this and SolarWorld did this, et cetera. I don't know how to avoid that, but you see what I'm trying to get at? I don't want them to have, and similarly, I don't want ARPA-E, which is meant by its nature to be a nimble, quick operation, to say, well, we're going to have to go backwards and say, you know, how much did BMW spend on hydrogen? How do you do? What's your response, if I may, to that?
Well, I mean, there's no specific prohibition. I mean, there's still the flexibility there that, as you have pointed out, is one of the benefits of ARPA-E and should continue to experience that. I mean, that's what we need. It's just that I don't want these taxpayer dollars supplanting other private dollars that are more appropriately spent.
I share that concern. Are you, would the, and maybe this is yet to be resolved and we don't have to solve it here, but It'd be one thing if I'm working for a major company and I know exactly what my particular company has spent on the investment up to now, and I just say the company I work for has already invested X amount of dollars. And then the secretary could say, okay, I get it, we still think it's worthwhile. Is the gentleman suggesting, though, that disclosure should be total private sector investment across, on the issue, or just the particular entity for which you work?
The particular entity or applicant, not other private.
That's a helpful clarification. I think that I appreciate that, and yield back.
Dr. Barrett, I would say that Mr. Smith's amendment is made in good faith and not intended to undermine anything that we would want. But I would also say that, you know, I would hope that we would accept it and continue to discuss it. More knowledge can come about between now and later, and we'll, again, I don't know that it needs to be, but we ought to continue to discuss it. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, and again, I respectfully disagree with my good friend, Mr. Baird, that is not the purpose, as you described it, is not the purpose of ARPA-E. It is not to bolster private efforts. It's basically, and if I might read from the authorization of ARPA-E, it's accelerating transformational technological advances in areas that industry by itself is not likely to undertake because of technical and financial uncertainty. And the fact is, if we are supposed to be taking this, ARPA-E is supposed to go out, and this, we've heard this over and over again, to finance those projects that private industry won't finance because it's too risky. But we have accepted the fact that some of the experts at ARPA-E will determine maybe these will have a potentially high payoff for the country, but they're too risky for private industry to finance. That's basically what we're talking about here, but we're evolving into a subsidizing of efforts that don't quite meet that threshold. Let me give you an example.
Would the gentleman yield in a moment? Just
Yes, I will in a moment. I have 3 examples here of ARPA-E funding of it's phonemic devices received $1 million in capital, venture capital, before ARPA-E gave them an award. Flow design industry received a major investment of $8 billion before ARPA-E gave them their grant. Sun Catalyx, I guess it is, received $1 million in funding, venture funding from the private sector prior to ARPA-E giving them their grant. We've been sold the idea that ARPA-E is necessary for companies that are involved in projects that cannot attract private sector investment. So what we should be doing here is exactly what Mr. Smith is trying to achieve, and that is making sure that all of this is transparent so we can decide, as in our oversight capacity, as to whether or not ARPA or any other organization is meeting the goals and the criteria that we have set out legislatively. And I'd be happy to yield to my friend, Mr. Beard.
my friend, I'm afraid you put words into my mouth and then refuted the words that I didn't say, but you said on my behalf, and so I want to reclaim my own words.
All right.
I think what you said is pretty much what I said. I don't think I said the purpose of ARPA-E is to bolster private enterprise. I think what I said was there are certain high-risk activities that ARPA-E can contribute to that the private sector may decide financially that's not on and of itself a high enough probability of return, but it may have huge upside potential. We see the same in medications, et cetera. The other thing I want to just underscore, if I may, the nature of this industry is such that venture cap plays a critical role. And these entrepreneurs, by necessity, are going to pursue venture cap money and ARPA-E money simultaneously. We really are going to mess up the whole enterprise if we say, you can apply to ARPA-E, but the minute you get some venture cap, you're toast, because you're going to actually implode the whole thing, because ideally, if you've got a good idea, you ought to be pursuing it in every way you can. And if we suddenly tell people, you know, if you get $1 of venture cap, you're going to lose your ARPA-E or vice versa, I think we're creating a really bad model there.
Reclaiming my time, just say we may not have a disagreement, but we both agree on transparency, and that's what this amendment.
100% with the transparency argument.
Governor Garamendi? Okay. it looks like after we ran around the bush, we're all back together. So once again, thank you, Mr. Smith, for this amendment, and we will, again, we'll continue to look at it, see if it needs any clarification, but it looks to me like you're on the right direction. So if there's no further discussion, with the vote occurs on the amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I have an amendment to desk, Mr. Chairman, to ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 006, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Olson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to offer this amendment. This amendment seeks to do two things. First, in the ARPA title, in regards to awards that the director may initiate, it changes the word shall to may. As it stands, the director would have to make a variety of different awards, grants, contracts, cash prizes, and other transactions, regardless of whether there are fitting topics or worthy applications. To me, this is not a wise use of taxpayer funds and undermines the competitive nature of this endeavor in particular, and this legislation in general. I think changing it to may will give the director the flexibility to fund projects as he or she sees fit. And secondly, the original competes language that was adopted 3 years ago stipulated that ARPA-E would hire no less than 70 employees and no more than 120. And this was done intentionally to keep ARPA-E nimble and agile. The bill language before us today would eliminate that limitation, thereby allowing the staff of ARPA-E to be unlimited in number. Although subsequently amended, there was an attempt to allow ARPA-E to have its own legal counsel, procurement staff, and program directors instead of what existed in the Department of Energy. The manager's amendment has kept the language on staffing in place, but removed the specific references to particular staff. However, there's nothing to prevent report language from directing the Department of Energy that the intent of this language is for them to have separate staff in these positions. The intent of these changes is troubling because although I was not here for the creation of ARPA-E, I understand it was not meant to be its own quasi-department. Actions like unlimited hiring and having offices apart and aside from the Department of Energy certainly make it appear as if it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Olson, for this clarification. Is there any further discussion? Dr. Baird.
Mr. Chairman, a friendly suggestion on this. I've done some checking, and it's my understanding that if the gentleman's language were to pass, he would effectively be requiring a doubling of the current staff of ARPA-E, thereby growing government. And the reason for that is the numbers specifically set both a floor and a ceiling, and ARPA-E does not yet achieve the floor. And so if you're insisting that the floor be achieved, you would actually be insisting that we hire new employees to meet the floor. At least that's my read of it. And I'm not sure that's his intent. That'd be the first point I'd make. The second point is, if you want to be quick and nimble and responsive, which ARPA-E has already distinguished itself as, you may have to actually have some of your own staff. We're not necessarily mandating that you do, but if you know, as a business model, if you want to create a branch of your business that's most effective, you're going to want to have some in-house resources. And for us to here arbitrarily constrain ARPA-E, I appreciate the ceiling number, but I don't think we should get into saying, well, you can hire this kind of person and that kind of person, but not this other kind of person. But anyway, maybe staff can correct me, but my understanding is ARPA-E current staff is about 16. They're planning to go up to about 35, and they're not going to, they may start reaching the higher numbers later on, but would this amendment require, would council tell us, would this amendment, as you read it, require us to, require ARPA-E to go out and hire a bunch of people to comply with the amendment? Or is there a need to change it?
The amendment would reinsert language that was struck in the amendment in the nature of a substitute from the original ARPA-E statute that required 70 to 120 employees for ARPA-E.
So if they have 35 now, and he's now striking language or he's now reinstating language that requires them to have 70, are we not effectively requiring them to have 70, potentially? Or run afoul of this legislation?
Yes, the original language that was struck in the ANS said the director shall appoint not less than 70 and not more than 120 personnel under this section. The current staffing of full-time employees at ARPA-E is 16, I believe. And the budget for next year calls for up to 35.
I thank counsel. In the interest of not growing government, I'd have to oppose this.
Mr. Chairman? If the gentleman, or I'll take my time, to clarify, Mr. Olson, this was not an effort to try to take the ceiling off and have a great bureaucracy. It was really an effort to not have have a floor. We didn't want to force them to have 70. And so I think we're all trying to accomplish, the same thing.
However, the ceiling has been eliminated as well as the floor.
Again, and they're at 16, not wanting to go, more than 35 and coming. So what I would suggest is that we can either have a vote or you might withdraw this. We'll work a little later. Again, we were trying to get to the same place in that, I mean, you were trying to stop at the top. We were trying to force you from making them have more. Now, when they need them, they ought to have them, but that's not anytime soon.
Mr. Chairman, would you be going on record as then agreeing to reinstating the ceiling as this goes to the floor?
I think that we would, but I would rather discuss it and we can deal with it later.
I would recommend to Mr. Olson to accept the chairman's very generous offer.
I appreciate the chairman's offer, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be much happily talk about keeping the ceiling and just eliminating the floor. If that's a concern, it sounds like if there's 16 people there, we can all agree to it. But thank you very much for.
Yeah, I think that, and so we'll work together. We may give them a little. We'll work together to come up with something that is compatible. But again, the purpose of that was not at any time soon to force them to have to hire people.
I appreciate that, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Jeremiah, Governor Jeremiah.
The amendment also deals with who can be hired. Is that correct? By suggesting that certain people could not be hired, for example, lawyers and the like? Is that part of the amendment?
That's not part of the amendment, sir. What the amendment does is it prevents them from hiring specific positions within ARPA, positions that are in the Department of Energy. And right now, my concern is growing government here, getting duplicative personnel within the department and in ARPA, when, again, there's not an authorization.
Thank you for the response. If an organization is going to run, and I did run an organization in government, like the Department of Interior's Deputy Secretary, in various sections, to have a staff that is directly responsible to the administrator, or to the director in this case, it's very important in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And we ought to allow the director of this ARPA-E to hire those people that are necessary to carry out the task. That may be a lawyer, it may be a financial wizard of one sort or another, or a scientist of any type, by not allowing them to hire those kinds of people that may be in a completely different section and not readily available to to ARPA-E. You may severely limit the effectiveness and the efficiency of ARPA-E. So I would suggest that particular requirement that apparently is in your amendment not be there, and that we allow the director to hire those people necessary to carry out their task. Does that mean that the overall department will increase? Not necessarily. There are hiring restrictions within the department, authorizations for a certain number of personnel within the department, and it may be that that lawyer comes from the general counsel's office and works directly in ARPA-E with funding for that lawyer coming from ARPA-E. So I think that as we study this, Mr. Chairman, we ought not restrict the ability of the director of ARPA-E to bring on board, using ARPA-E's budget, those people that are necessary for the efficient and effective management.
I think the gentleman has agreed to to withdraw his amendment. I think that again, the thrust here is that with some, there is some concern about ARPA and some concern or mistrust. From our standpoint, that are comfortable with ARPA is we wanted to really show an abundance of confidence there. So why don't we continue to work a little bit on this, and then we'll try to come up with something that is good public policy and that we all feel comfortable with. Is that acceptable, Mr. Olson?
That's acceptable, Mr. Chairman, and just one clarification I'd like to make. I mean, my amendment, there's not my intention to restrict the personnel that the ARPA director could hire. My purpose is to not go out and start hiring specific new positions and creating new positions within ARPA. If the director believes he needs an attorney, then he or she can hire an attorney. But I don't want to create this bureaucracy and start putting out titles, which is all we all know have an impact in the federal government. I mean, once you get as you get the hierarchy up there, become SES and those type positions, then all sorts of things would come into play. I want him to have his freedom, and I appreciate the chairman's comments. Look forward to working to make the clarifications that we've talked about here. Thank you.
Thank you. We're getting ready to start several votes here. I have to meet somebody outside. Mr. Baird is going to help us get through 2 or 3 more amendments, and then with no objection, we will convene again 15 minutes after the last vote.
So Mr. Olson has withdrawn his amendment, and I thank you, and I hope to personally be part of that discussion as well, because I think your amendment is well-intentioned, and we can hopefully work with you on that. The next amendment on the roster was the 37th Amendment, but that has been withdrawn. So next, we're going to skip Mr. Bartlett because, well, we'll postpone consideration of his amendment, the 38th Amendment on the list. We now move to Ms. Biggert as an amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 018, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
Ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection so ordered. Recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment strikes a construction exception for the energy innovation hubs. The mission of the Energy Innovation Hubs is that of timely and goal-oriented research that could turn on a dime, and we need these, and I support what the Secretary proposes to do with each hub. Unfortunately, the exception language here appears unlimited. I don't know if you know what a test bed is or not, and I would ask you when I finish here, but in the absence of appropriations to support all the hubs, I believe we should be judicious in our attempts to facilitate their deployment. And anyone working with the department could justify a renovation or construction need if it's, quote, necessary for the research to be conducted, end quote. So such exceptions could cause the hubs to become little national labs, totally undermining their mission and creating another drain on the funding. And so that's why I believe it's important at this juncture to include a basic prohibition on construction language. And I'd like to add that I work with my colleague and caucus co-chairman, Mr. Carnahan, to support a building technologies hub, and I can understand the need for possible renovations or small demo projects to conduct building technologies research. However, in the absence of further appropriations, I think we'd be foolish to create such a broad exception for all of these hubs. I don't know if the language is quite where I'd like to see it, but I think that, you know, there's no definition of test beds in this legislation, and with that, I would urge. In other words, there's the Energy Frontier Research Centers and the technology hubs that I think are duplicate. There's some duplication with the labs, and so I think that this construction would be a bad idea. That I would yield.
You want to yield, or you want to yield back then?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Carnahan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to compliment my colleague, Mrs. Biggert, for her work, co-chairing the High Performance Buildings Caucus with me and working on many of these issues together. I really appreciate her leadership. But I do reluctantly and respectfully oppose your amendment, and I just want to give a couple of reasons why. I think we sort of have the same goal with a different way to come about it. And that is, this exception, I think, is important. First of all, we don't want these hubs to become national labs. That's why there's a specific deadline. They're authorized for only up to 5 years in a competitive process, and for them to be, and they'd have to compete after that to continue. We want to get this technology out quickly with resources and with urgency and to get results. The other thing, I think, in terms of the exception for construction of advanced building efficiency test beds or to renovate existing buildings, there are specific limitations. It can only be for the purposes of research and only if the Oversight Board determines that the test bed or renovations are limited in scope and scale necessary for the research to be conducted. So I think there are specific limitations in this to be sure that these don't become national labs. And I guess the other examples I would say, you know, say you are at a buildings hub and you want to construct a test bed or smaller scale building to test a design. Without that section, you'd be limited from doing it. The other example, I would say, if we did include renovations to existing buildings for the purposes of research, but there is an oversight board that will have to approve such requests. So I think, again, there are limitations included in the bill that address your concerns.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
I think the issue that really troubles me is the test bed. I think that there could be any asking for construction and just saying they are a test bed. That I don't know what a test bed is, and there's nothing in this bill that defines that.
If the lady would yield, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 has a specific definition when they established the Advanced Building Efficiency Test Bed section, and I'd be happy to provide that.
Yeah,
that to you. So I think there is definition in existing law.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I do have what the Act of 2005 says. But still, the problem is that that was. I asked the Department of Energy to give us a definition and to give us what that was, and we've never heard back from them. And I was upset with that because to try and look at this language. But what we did find is that there was an Advanced Building Efficiency Test Bed Initiative dated October 6th through May of '08, and in that it turned out that it really was a earmark. And so I have seen nothing, it looks like I have seen nothing other than that earmark as being what is called a test bed. And I don't know whether people just could use that based on that or other than any definition that's in the 2005 language. And I'd really like to work with you, to see if we could work out some limitation on that. I think that opens the door to so many projects being called a test bed and asking for the funding, which in construction can eat up the whole, the whole amount of money in a very short time.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, I'd be happy to work with the gentlelady in terms of that language, just to be sure that we are limiting it as I think intended, and that the funding is focused on research. I yield back.
Ms. Biggert, I share your concern, and I think my read of the committee here is that I think everybody's on the same page here. I don't think anybody wants money that should be going to hubs to become just some excuse to build a new building to be named after the former dean or something. That's not the purpose of the, and we've seen that happens, and then when earmarks get in there, then it gets named after us, and that's even more fun. But so So I wonder if there's general support of the principle, here. I wonder if you might be kind enough to withdraw that on the commitment that we'll work to try to clarify some of the issues you mentioned, because I think there's strong agreement with the principle.
I'd be happy to do that. withdraw
I
the
respect
amendment.
and thank that, and Mr. Carnahan and the committee will work. We're now down to
Mr.
five.
Chairman?
Yes. Is there?
How about members of Congress? Can we name buildings after members of
Well,
Congress?
that's the exception. We'll perfectly allow that. I hope that comes in the discussion. Yes. We're down to 5 minutes, my colleagues. If consistent with Chairman Gordon's suggestion, we will recess until 15 minutes after completion of the final vote of this series. And Ms. Johnson, my apologies, but we are not going to be able to do justice to your amendment in time. I don't see it.
Y'all need to stop meeting so much, because there are other committees that meet too.
Committee stands in recess.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, we're down to less than 5. And
Oh, we just getting 5.
What's that?
I said, they just announced 5.
No, we're down to 5. So they just, I mean, we had 20 seconds. If you think you could have brought your bill up and had the debate and solved it in 5.
The reason why I think so, we've worked with all of them.
Okay, well, I was actually trying to be courteous, not disrespectful. I didn't want to.
I forgive you.
Okay. I was trying to make sure we gave you adequate time.
Right here. John.